9 o'clock on the morning of January 3, 2002, Maria Elena Rodriguez walked into her branch of Banco Nación in Buenos Aires and found the doors locked. A handwritten notice taped to the glass said withdrawals were suspended. She had 23,000 pesos in that account. It represented 11 years of savings, school fees set aside for her daughter, money she had converted from dollars into pesos, because the government had guaranteed the exchange rate would hold. The rate did not hold. What happened next took 11 days. On January 6th, Argentina abandoned the peso's peg to the US dollar. On January 7, the government converted all dollar-denominated bank deposits into pesos at a rate that immediately wiped out 40% of their value. By the time the restrictions were lifted, Maria Elena's 23,000 pesos bought what 11,000 pesos would have bought the year before. She had not made a single bad financial decision. She had saved diligently, trusted her government's guarantee, and kept her money in a regulated bank. None of it protected her. The mechanism that destroyed her savings was not fraud, not mismanagement, not bad luck. It was a currency transition, a change in the monetary system that the people running it had not publicly signaled until the moment it was too late to respond. The dollar has now been the world's reserve currency for 80 years. Its share of global central bank reserves has fallen from 85% in 1977 to 57% in 2024, its lowest level in 30 years. The United States is carrying $36 trillion in national debt, with interest payments that now exceed defense spending. This video is not about Argentina. It is about what happens to savings when the currency that underpins them begins to lose the position that made them safe. Before we examine what is happening to the dollar, it is worth being precise about the mechanism. Because when most people hear the phrase dollar collapse, they imagine a single catastrophic event, a day when the currency becomes worthless, shops close, savings disappear overnight. That is not what the historical record shows. That is not what happened in Britain in the 1940s and 1950s. That is not what happened to the dollar itself between 1971 and 1980. What the record shows is something more insidious. Reserve currency decline is a slow process that looks invisible from the inside until it is too late to position around it. It operates through three distinct channels, all of which affect savings directly. The first is purchasing power erosion. When the dollar was at its strongest, the 1950s and 1960s, a dollar's worth of savings bought a dollar's worth of goods. As the dollar weakened against other currencies through the 1970s, Americans discovered that a vacation in Europe, a Japanese car, or any imported good had become significantly more expensive. Their savings had not shrunk in number, they had shrunk in what they could actually buy. The second is inflation. Reserve currency decline and inflation are not the same thing, but they are closely related. When a currency loses reserve status, the excess dollars previously held as reserves by foreign central banks begin flowing back into the domestic economy. The Federal Reserve's own data shows that the inflationary surge of the 1970s, which peaked at 13.5% in 1980, was partly driven by the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the resulting surplus of dollars in global circulation. The third is interest rate volatility. When reserve status comes under pressure, governments must raise interest rates to attract foreign capital and maintain demand for their currency. Between 1979 and 1981, Paul Volcker raised the Federal Reserve's benchmark rate to 20% to defend the dollar's position. Mortgage rates hit 18%. Businesses that had borrowed at lower rates faced ruin. The savings of those who held fixed-rate bonds were protected. The savings of those who held variable-rate loans were not. Before we go further, if this kind of history matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around the financial decisions that actually changed the world. The crises, the policy failures, the moments when the system revealed what it was designed to protect. If that is the kind of analysis you want to keep watching, the subscribe button is how you tell us. And we want to hear from you. Did you live through one of these turning points? The 2008 collapse, the 70s oil shock, the end of Bretton Woods. Did it change your family's circumstances, your understanding of how money actually works? Leave it in the comments. The most complete record of these events is not in any official report. It is in the people who were paying attention. Now, back to the account. The last time the world's reserve currency changed hands, most of the people whose savings were affected did not know it was happening until it was over. The pound sterling had dominated global finance for nearly 2 centuries. At its peak in the 1870s, Britain controlled 40% of global foreign investment. Sterling was the currency in which commodities were priced, trade was invoiced, and central bank reserves were held. The system that backed it was the gold standard, sterling convertible to gold at a fixed rate, the guarantee that underpinned every transaction on Earth. Between 1913 and 1945, that position was dismantled. 2 world wars required Britain to liquidate its foreign investments, borrow heavily from the United States, and spend its gold reserves. By 1945, Britain had gone from the world's largest creditor to a net debtor. The United States held 2/3 of the world's monetary gold. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 formalized what had already become reality. The dollar had replaced sterling as the world's reserve currency, but ordinary British savers did not experience the transition as a single event. What they experienced was a decade of consequences. Rationing that lasted until 1954, 9 years after the war ended. Inflation that averaged 8% through the late 1940s. The devaluation of sterling against the dollar in 1949, which reduced the international purchasing power of every pound in a British savings account by 30% overnight. The Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain's inability to defend its currency without American support made visible what had been obscured for a decade, that sterling's reserve role was over, and the savings denominated in it would no longer carry the international purchasing power they once had. Sterling's share of global reserves fell from 80% in the 1920s to under 10% by the 1970s. The people whose savings were in sterling did not choose to participate in that transition. They were simply holding the wrong currency when the monetary system changed. To understand what changes when reserve currency status shifts, you first have to understand what the dollar system has been doing for savings, invisibly, automatically, without most people ever noticing. When the dollar is the world's reserve currency, every country's central bank must hold dollars to conduct international trade. That structural demand keeps the dollar strong relative to other currencies. A strong dollar means import prices in America stay low. Food, electronics, clothing, and energy, all of which contain components sourced internationally, cost less than they would in a world where the dollar had to compete for buyers. This is not a trivial benefit. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimated that dollar reserve status saves the average American household approximately $1,000 per year in lower prices for goods and services. It suppresses import inflation. It allows the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates lower than would otherwise be possible. And it makes U.S. Treasury bonds the world's preferred safe haven asset, meaning the government can borrow cheaply, which keeps mortgage rates lower than they would otherwise be. All of this flows to savings directly. Lower mortgage rates mean more purchasing power available to save. Lower import prices mean savings stretch further. Lower interest rates on government debt mean the Treasury can run larger deficits without immediately passing the cost to consumers through higher inflation. The petrodollar system, the arrangement that emerged from U.S.-Saudi negotiations in 1974 and tied oil pricing to the dollar, reinforced these benefits further. Because every country that needed oil needed dollars, the structural demand for the dollar was not merely financial but physical. It was embedded in the energy systems that power every economy on Earth. That architecture is now under documented pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The International Monetary Fund publishes the currency composition of global central bank reserves every quarter. The data is public, precise, and consistent, and it tells a story that does not appear in any bank statement, any pension fund report, or any financial advisor's presentation. In the first quarter of 2015, the dollar held 66% of global central bank reserves. By the third quarter of 2024, that share had declined to 57.4%, its lowest level since 1994. That is a fall of 8.6 percentage points in less than 10 years. To put that in concrete terms, in 2015, for every $100 held in global reserves, 66 were in dollars. By 2024, only 57 were. Those $9 did not disappear. They moved into other currencies: the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar, the South Korean won, the Swedish krona, and increasing quantities of gold. Currencies that no economist is proposing as the new global reserve, but which central banks are holding instead of dollars. The fiscal picture compounds the data. At the start of 2025, the United States national debt stood at $36 trillion, 124% of gross domestic product. In fiscal year 2024, the government paid $879 billion in interest on that debt. That figure exceeded both Medicare spending and national defense spending. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments will exceed defense spending every year through at least 2034. The relationship between these two data series, declining reserve share and expanding debt service, is not incidental, it is structural. The more the dollar's reserve roll declines, the less the U.S. government can borrow at preferential rates. The higher borrowing costs rise, the larger the debt service burden becomes. And the larger the debt service burden, the more pressure there is on the Federal Reserve to keep rates low, which in turn weakens the dollar's appeal as a reserve asset. The data describes a feedback loop, not a catastrophe, but a direction. Since 2015, central banks globally have bought gold at rates not seen since the 1960s. Russia and China alone have added over 3,600 tons to their gold holdings since 2005. Gold's share of official reserve assets has more than doubled from below 10% in 2015 to over 23% now. The people running the world's monetary institutions are not panicking, but they are positioning. The historical record of what happens to savings during reserve currency transitions is specific enough to be useful and consistent enough to apply across different economic contexts. In the United States, the period from 1971 to 1982, which corresponds to the first major dollar reserve decline, from Nixon's gold window closure through the Volcker shock, produced outcomes that savers experienced very differently depending on what they held. Savings held in cash or bank accounts lost purchasing power continuously. Inflation averaged 7% annually between 1973 and 1982. A dollar saved in 1973 bought 66 cents worth of goods by 1982, not because of fraud, not because of bank failure. Simply because the currency was no longer as trusted internationally as it had been, and the excess dollars that flowed back into the domestic economy pushed prices up. Savings held in United States Treasury bonds with long maturities were devastated. As interest rates rose to 20% under Volcker, the market value of existing bonds collapsed. A 30-year Treasury bond purchased in 1970 at 4.5% had lost 70% of its market value by 1981. The nominal amount was repaid at maturity, but it was repaid in dollars that bought a fraction of what they had bought when the bond was purchased. Savings held in hard assets, commodities, farmland, energy stocks, gold, performed substantially better. Gold rose from $35 per ounce in 1971 to $850 per ounce in January 1980. Oil company stocks returned an average of 19% annually through the 1970s, compared to negative real returns for stocks in the broader market. Farmland doubled in value through the decade. A pattern from sterling's decline was similar. The British savers who preserved their wealth through the 1944 to 1970 transition were disproportionately those who held assets in currencies other than sterling, in commodities, or in overseas stocks that generated income in currencies gaining rather than losing ground. The pattern is consistent, it is documented, and it is not a prediction about what will happen. It is a record of what has happened, twice. When the world's reserve currency began its structural decline, Maria Elena Rodriguez did not know that Argentina's monetary system was about to change. She had no reason to. The government's guarantee had held for 11 years. Her bank was regulated. Her savings were real. And then they were not. The dollar's position is not Argentina's position. The United States is not a small economy with a peripheral currency pegged to a stronger one. It is the world's largest economy, the issuer of the world's reserve currency, with the world's deepest and most liquid financial markets. The comparison is not about equivalence, it is about mechanism. The mechanism is this. Savings denominated in a currency whose reserve roll is declining face three compounding risks: purchasing power erosion, inflation risk, and interest rate volatility that do not appear in the account balance. They appear later, in what the savings can actually buy, and in the rate at which the debt attached to those savings is being serviced. The dollar's reserve share is at its lowest point since 1994. The United States National Debt Service exceeds its defense budget. Central banks are buying gold at 1960s rates. None of these facts are predictions. They are current readings of publicly available data. The historical record of what happened to savings during the last two reserve currency transitions is equally public, equally available, and equally ignored by most of the people it would most benefit to read. Sterling's decline destroyed the purchasing power of British savers who held only sterling. It protected those who diversified. The dollar's first major decline in the 1970s destroyed the real value of cash savings and long-duration bonds. It substantially rewarded those who held hard assets, energy stocks, and currencies that were gaining ground. History does not guarantee that the current dollar decline will follow the same path, but it does establish what the path has looked like, twice, under broadly similar conditions. The question for anyone holding savings denominated entirely in US dollars is not whether to be alarmed, it is whether to be informed. If this account has given you a clearer understanding of how financial power actually operates, subscribe to the channel. There are more crises, more decisions, more turning points still to document. And if this period of history connects to something you lived through or something a family member witnessed, the bank runs, the inflation, the austerity, the moment a system everyone trusted stopped working, tell us in the comments, what did they see? What did it cost them? What did they believe afterwards? The official version of these events is always written by the institutions that survived them. The fuller version belongs to the people who did not.